Welcome to my channel of Gill Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. They thought he was just a tired man at the bus stop, until one wrong move revealed a former Marine they should have never messed with. The bus stop bench groaned softly under the weight of the man who sat there slouched, yet somehow composed. His name was Darren, a face etched with exhaustion, his dark skin glistening under the flicker of a faulty streetlight. It was nearing midnight, the streets of Kansas City unusually quiet for a Friday night. Darren's shoulders slumped under the weight of his backpack, filled with tools from his day job as a mechanic. Tonight, he was coming from his second shift cleaning offices. He rubbed his temples, feeling the ache of a long week. All he wanted was to get home, sit in his worn recliner, and maybe catch a few hours of sleep. Before it all started again, the sharp laugh of a group of young men a few feet away caught his attention. Darren glanced over briefly. Four of them no older than their mid-20s, dressed in oversized hoodies, their voices loud and sharp against the night air. "Yo, old man," one of them called out. Darren ignored them, tightening his grip on his bag. "What's up, you deaf?" Another voice chimed in, the words laced with mockery. Darren didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared straight ahead. His military training had taught him discipline, even in moments like this. But the voices grew louder, the words more cutting. One of the men threw an empty soda can, hitting the ground just inches from Darren's boots. For a moment, Darren's face remained calm, unreadable, but deep inside, something stirred. It's always the loud ones. He thought, the ones who never know when to quit. But sometimes ignoring trouble only makes it louder. Darren had seen this type of situation before. It wasn't the first time, and he doubted it would be the last. Over the years, he'd learned that some people saw a tired man in worn-out clothes and assumed weakness. They didn't see the man who had served to tour overseas. They didn't know about the countless hours he spent honing his skills that had saved lives. His life after the Marines hadn't been easy. Returning to civilian life was a battlefield of its own. Jobs were scarce, bills piled up, and the world rarely cared about the sacrifices made by those like him. Darren took whatever work he could find, sometimes juggling 2 or 3 jobs, just to keep the lights on. Yet no matter how hard things got, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Tonight was no different. He wasn't dressed to impress. Just a faded blue work shirt, scuffed jeans, and steel-toe boots. His hands, calloused from years of labor, rested on his knees. He looked like any other working-class man, trying to make it through another day. But Darren wasn't just any man. Underneath his calm exterior was a relentless fighter. A man who had faced enemies far more dangerous than a few rowdy kids. Still, he had no desire to fight tonight. He wanted peace, a rare luxury these days. One of the young men stepped closer, his sneakers scuffing against the concrete. "What, you too good to talk to us?" he sneered, his tone dripping with bravado. Darren glanced up, his eyes meeting the young man's for the first time. They were steady, unshaken. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he said simply, his voice low and even. The young man smirked, leaning toward his friends. "Hear that? He's too busy for us. Must think he's better than us." The others laughed, emboldened by his performance. But bravado can quickly turn into something far more dangerous. The laughter echoed through the empty street, bouncing off the walls of the nearby buildings. Darren stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faint headlights of a distant bus flickered. He took a deep breath, centering himself. The leader of the group, a wiry young man with a baseball cap, turned backward, took a step closer. "Man, look at you sitting there like you own the place. Bet you don't even belong around here," he taunted. Darren didn't respond. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, the only indication that he'd even heard the comment. But that silence only fueled their aggression. Another man in the group chimed in, tossing a crumpled fast food wrapper that landed near Darren's boots. "Come on, old man. You scared or something?" Still nothing. Darren's face remained calm, but inside a different story played out. He was assessing the situation, His training kicked in instinctively. For aggressors all close range, with one trying to dominate the interaction. Their postures and movements were all show. More bark than bite, at least that's what Darren hoped, but then the man in the baseball cap took another step forward, this time crossing a line Darren couldn't ignore. He reached out, shoving Darren's shoulder just enough to test him. "Yeah, that's what I thought, weak." Darren stood up slowly, deliberately. His movements controlled. He was taller than the man, broader to his frame, still powerful. "Despite the years of hard work and long nights, you don't want to do this," Darren said quietly, his voice steady but firm. The group erupted in laughter again, but there was a slight shift in the air. Darren's tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't weak either. It carried a weight they weren't expecting. "Man, who do you think you are? Some kind of tough guy?" Baseball cap scoffed, stepping even closer, his friends egging him on. Darren took another deep breath. He didn't want this to escalate, but he also knew that avoiding it might only encourage them further. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away," he said, looking baseball cap straight in the eye. "Don't waste it." "But some people only understand lessons the hard way," baseball cap laughed, but it was forced. The kind of laugh meant to mask nerves. His friends, watching closely, started jeering louder to push him forward. The tension thickened as the young man stepped even closer to Darren. Now only a foot away. "What are you gonna do?" Baseball cap said, his voice laced with mockery. "You think you scare me, old man?" Darren didn't move, his eyes, calm and steady, locked onto the younger man's. He could feel the weight of their stares. The group testing him, waiting for a reaction. He'd seen this dynamic 100 times before, in combat zones, in rough neighborhoods. And now here at a bus stop, it was always the same. Someone looking to prove something. Someone too blinded by pride to back down. Baseball cap lunged suddenly, pushing Darren's chest with both hands. Darren staggered back a step, but didn't retaliate, not yet. His silence, his restraint, seemed to frustrate them even more. "Oh, you're tough now, huh?" one of the others shouted, stepping forward. "Let's see how tough." And just like that, the situation spiraled. Baseball cap swung first, a wild, sloppy punch aimed at Darren's face. But Darren moved like water, sidestepping effortlessly, his movements fluid and deliberate. Before the punch even finished its arc, Darren's hand shot out, gripping baseball cap's wrist like a vice. "Stop," Darren said, his voice a low growl, now commanding and sharp. But the others rushed in. One grabbed at Darren's arm, while another swung at his side. Darren released the first man's wrist and pivoted, his training taking over in seconds. His hand caught the next punch midair, twisting the attacker's arm, just enough to send him sprawling onto the pavement. The third man hesitated, but lunged anyway, and Darren spun him around, using his own momentum to knock him off balance. The scuffle wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, controlled. Darren wasn't trying to hurt them. He was trying to end it. "Enough," Darren said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. His words weren't a plea, they were a command. The young men backed up, panting and wide-eyed. Darren stood there unshaken, his posture steady, as if none of this had fazed him. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos just moments before. But silence often speaks louder than words. And the lesson wasn't over yet. The young men stood frozen, their bravado evaporating into the cool night air. Darren's presence, now towering and unshakable, seemed to root them in place. Baseball cap nursed his wrist, eyes darting between his friends and Darren. He wanted to say something, to salvage the scraps of his pride. But no words came. Darren's gaze swept across them. "Calm but unyielding, you're lucky," he said finally, his voice steady and firm, "because I've had a long day, and I don't have the energy to teach you what real pain feels like." The words landed heavily, not because they were loud, but because they were true. Darren had fought in places where survival meant quick decisions and decisive action. He'd seen things that had stolen pieces of him he could never get back. These boys didn't know the line they almost crossed. Baseball cap, desperate to save face, spat at the ground near Darren's feet. "Oh, whatever, man. You ain't special." Darren stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, leaning down, so that his face was level with the young man's. "I'm not special," he said, his voice low and even, "but I've seen what happens to people who think they're untouchable. Trust me, you don't want to find out." The others shifted nervously, glancing at each other, their confidence crumbling. Darren didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. His calm was more intimidating than any shout could have been. Now Darren continued, straightening his posture. "I suggest you take this as your warning and walk away while you still can." The group hesitated, their youthful arrogance clashing with the unmistakable reality that they were outmatched. Finally, one of them muttered, "Let's go," and started backing away. The others followed, dragging their feet, throwing half-hearted insults over their shoulders. To save face, Darren watched them until they disappeared down the block. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. He wasn't angry, not anymore. What he felt was something deeper, a mix of pity and frustration. He'd seen too many young men like them, blinded by their need to prove something, often learning the hard way that the world didn't owe them anything. As the distant rumble of the bus approached, Darren sat back down on the bench, picking up his bag. The night felt a little heavier now, not because of what had happened, but because of what could have. But for Darren, the lesson wasn't just for them. It was a reminder for himself too. The bus arrived with a low hiss, its doors folding open like a reluctant sigh. Darren climbed aboard, nodding politely to the driver, then made his way to an empty seat near the back. He dropped his bag on the floor and leaned back, staring out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white. The adrenaline had faded now, leaving only the familiar weight of exhaustion. He wasn't proud of what had happened, but he wasn't ashamed either. He had given those young men every opportunity to walk away. What they'd gotten was the gentlest version of a lesson he could teach. As the bus rolled through the quiet streets, Darren thought about the choices people make. The young men had been looking for trouble, and they'd almost found more than they could handle. He wondered where they were now, if they were laughing it off, or if any part of what had happened would stick with them. For Darren, the moment wasn't just about them, it was a reflection of his own journey. Life had thrown its punches at him too, testing his resolve in ways those kids couldn't imagine. But through it all, he'd learned the value of restraint, the strength it took to choose peace when the world seemed determined to provoke conflict. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Long night, huh?" The bus driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Darren chuckled, faintly nodding. You could say that the driver gave a knowing smile and turned back to the road. Darren shifted in his seat, letting the hum of the engine soothe his mind. As the bus neared his stop, he stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder, stepping off into the cool night air. He walked the last block to his apartment. The small, modest space greeted him with the familiar creak of the floorboards. He set his bag down and collapsed into his recliner, staring at the ceiling. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, not with anger, but with quiet reflection. He thought about his younger self, the lessons he'd learned the hard way, and the people who had guided him toward the man he had become. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones where you hold yourself back. The night's events left Darren with a simple truth: respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. Those boys, like so many others, were trapped in a cycle of proving their worth in all the wrong ways. Darren hoped they would think back on this night and realize their strength in restraint, dignity in walking away before it's too late. He sat in his chair thinking not just about them, but about his own journey, how life had taught him that real power comes from knowing when to act and when to stand still. It's not about proving yourself to others. It's about knowing your worth and staying true to it. And maybe, just maybe, those young men would carry this night with them. A quiet reminder of the man who didn't raise his fists, but still left an impact they wouldn't soon forget. As you reflect on Darren's story, consider this: what battles are worth fighting, and which ones are better left alone? Respect is a two-way street, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose peace. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters.